Welcome, everyone. I'm Ellen Gray, a features reporter at the Inquirer. Thank you for joining us for Inquirer Live, where our guest today is Dawnie Walton, the author of The Final Revival of Opal and Nev. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At any time during this discussion, you may submit questions for our guest. Please ask your questions in the comment section at the bottom of this page. If you're watching on social platforms like Facebook or Twitter, please join us at Inquirer.com/Dawnie Walton Live. That's DAWNIE WALTON LIVE. And you can submit questions here. We'll take as many at the end as time allows. The Final Revival of Opal and Nev is a fictional oral history of a Black singer from Detroit and a white singer-songwriter from Britain who come together in the early 1970s to make groundbreaking music. It was a Book of the Month Club selection and was named one of the most anticipated books of 2021 by Essence, Vogue, Elle, O, the Oprah Magazine, and others. The Washington Post reviewer called it a dazzling debut. The New York Times reviewer wrote, "This novel is so good, I want to rent a velvet-swagged amphitheater and gather a large audience to blare through a microphone just how much I like it." Copies of Dawnie Walton's The Final Revival of Opal and Nev are available at Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books in Germantown. You may also order it online from Uncle Bobby's by clicking the link on this page. Dawnie Walton is a former deputy managing editor of Essence magazine who stepped away from journalism several years ago to pursue a career in fiction and the idea that became The Final Revival of Opal and Nev. She's been a McDowell Fellow and holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. I'm so happy to welcome Dawnie Walton to Inquirer Live.
Hi, Ellen. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. Those reviews, you worked on this book for several years, and these are the kind of reviews I think that authors dream about. What is it like to finally read somebody writing about your book?
So let me tell you, that New York Times review that you quoted about the velvet swag, the amphitheater, and all of that, that was the first thing I read on my release day. And I was still in bed and I had the phone in my hand and I screamed. And I took this giant gasp and woke my husband up and I said, it's good. It was, the experience was just it was gratifying, to know that all those years that I poured into it. And honestly, I do feel like in some ways, this is a story that I've wanted to tell for a big chunk of my life. To know that it was resonating with people is hugely thrilling, all those wonderful reviews, but also just the DMs that I get from people who are reading it, who say that the story resonates with them, that say that, Opal resonates with them. Those things are also very, very special.
Well, as with most books, this story didn't come to you exactly like in a dream and then you just started typing. Can you talk about the first idea and then how it evolved over time?
Yeah, so I always think back to the end of 2013, which is when the spark for the novel happened. I was watching 20 Feet from Stardom, which is a documentary about background singers. I think it won the Oscar that year. Mm-hmm. And I love music, I love film. So those two things coming together, that movie was really in my sweet spot. And in the first 5 minutes of that film, they show footage from Talking Heads concert movie called Stop Making Sense. And I love David Byrne. I have for a very long time. Loved Talking Heads in the 80s, Burning Down the House, and all those songs, and with the videos where he's just being very weird kind of person. And he was sort of doing those weird dance moves at center stage. But then to his left, you see his background singers, and they were two really incredible Black women whose names I did not know at the time, but I have since learned that they are Lynn Mabry and Edna Holt. And they were just so compelling. They sort of matched him in their gray short sets, and they had these braids and these bright red lipstick. And I was like, wow, like that could have been my aunt's or like something like that. And I just really had this urge to pull one of them to center stage and kind of see the magic that would happen between two people who kind of were very outwardly different, different races, different genders, but had some things in common in terms of their ambition and sort of the weirdness of their personalities. And the idea for those two characters just wouldn't let me go, and I hadn't really, honestly, at that time, hadn't written fiction in a very long time. I used to take little workshops around New York, but it had been years since I had even done that. But suddenly these two characters were really compelling me and really just started talking to me. And so I started waking up at 5 a.m. before my job at Essence. And I would just spend those hours before, getting dressed for work and commuting into the city, just kind of letting Opal talk. Like, her voice came to me first. And then the chorus around her kind of came in after that. And I worked that way on it for a couple of years until I decided to go even further and even deeper.
Well, I think your next step was Mcdowell Fellowship.
That's right.
So
yeah.
For those of us who are not part of that world, how does that work? What is a Mcdowell Fellowship and what does it get you?
So I'm so glad you asked this, because a lot of people just don't know that things like this exist. And I'm like, they're magic. You should know they exist. So McDowell, Yaddo, there are a few other prominent ones that are, they're basically places that you go and you live for a number of weeks. And at McDowell, they take care of absolutely everything, so that all you have to do is focus on your writing. So I had a studio in the woods. It's in New Hampshire. So, I went for 6 weeks, and they cook your meals. There's a wonderful chef. There is someone who actually, brings you a basket lunch and leaves it at your door when you're working in the middle of the day.
Like, imagine little fairies or
He's a wonderful man. His name is Blake. He's been working there for decades, and he is very beloved. And he brings you your food. Yeah. And you gather with other artists. So it's interdisciplinary. There are writers, but I also met composers and photographers and filmmakers. So it's a very creative energy, and there is no expectation from you as the artist, except that you're working. They're supporting your art. Of course, because these things are paid for, they're fully supported, they can be very competitive. And so when I applied, I was thinking, oh, there's no way I'm going to get this. Like, I don't have any connections. Nobody knows me. And, you apply to these things and you're always a little bit skeptical that it just has to do with the merit of the work. And to my surprise, I think this was the first signal to me that I was kind of onto something with Opal and Nev, was that I got into McDowell based on the first few pages of it.
Oh, really? It was just a few pages?
It was maybe, I actually just stumbled upon the application like recently. It was probably about 25 pages. Yeah.
And how different was that concept from what you now have out in print?
So at that time, it was just the straight interviews. So there was no, there's a character called Sunny in the book who's a journalist, and she compiles the interviews, she's curating the interviews, but she also pops up with editor's notes that are sort of written in a more traditionally narrative style. But Sunny has a personal tie to the history of Opal and Nev, and so there's all these complications. None of that was in the book. It was just basically Opal and Nev and a few key people around them sort of talking about, and it was the first oral histories that appear in the finished form. So it was Opal and Nev talking about their childhoods.
Well, one of the things that happened at McDowell is you discovered that you could go to grad school for.
Right. It's been like a process in every piece of the way I've learned the next step. So it's kind of like learning as I go. So I had learned about McDowell from a writer friend, had no idea that those things existed. And then once I went to McDowell, I learned that there are MFA programs that are fully funded. And that had always sort of been the barrier for me. to going to graduate school is that I was like, oh, I could never afford it. And then I don't know that I would want to pay for a degree that I don't know is going to ultimately pay off because, you know, like creativity is, everything is relative and you never know, there's no guarantees. So, but when I was there, I learned about these programs and I learned that there are actually a great number of them. And so it was October when I ended up leaving, when my residency at McDowell was over, and I came back to New York, and the applications for MFA programs were due that December. So I had to get to work. Pull together my applications, and I actually applied to 11 different programs around the country. I had no idea where I was going to end up. And something about that was kind of scary, but also very thrilling because I knew so clearly like this, I needed more time to work on this. And I wanted the support to finish it. And so, you know, I didn't know, I ended up at Iowa, but I applied to, you know, University of Florida and UC Irvine and Wisconsin. And
well, Iowa's a pretty big deal.
It was a big deal. Yes.
And so, and unlike I would think the McDowell where they just wanted you to work, they also want to talk about your work in an MFA program. So is that where Sunny came in?
Yes, actually. So my very first workshop in the fall of 2016, I brought in probably that same slightly edited set of pages that I had applied to McDowell with. And my classmate said, oh, you know, this is cool. This has energy. We really like it, but we're very curious. Who is everybody talking to? Who is on the other side of the recorder? And I thought, wow, that's a really kind of provocative and cool question. And at that point, I had written maybe about 2/3 of a full draft. And toward the end of that section of pages, I had one little paragraph, which was an interview from a woman who her college education had been funded entirely by Opal, because Opal had sort of wrecked her family in a very kind of messy way. And that was Opal's way of apologizing, was to pay for the daughter's education. And the character at the time was just sort of talking about, you know, her complicated feelings about that and the fact that she really admires Opal, but also has a little bit of some personal, you know, issues and resentments. And there was always something about that paragraph that I thought, wow, if I had the space to really blow up this character, I would do it. And so when my classmate said, you know, who is that on the other side of the recorder? I thought, maybe it's her. And I pulled her out and I wrote probably the first editor's note, which sort of, you know, sets out the stakes and clearly explains Sunny's identity and the fact that Opal and Nev are sort of this cults group, all of that. I probably wrote it in a day. It kind of came out in a rush. And at that point, I didn't know that the character would be appearing throughout the book, but I really liked the voice and I liked her conflicts and I liked the layers that she added to the story.
Well, I was wondering if maybe you had left her out originally because as a journalist, you didn't necessarily see the person telling the story as being part of the story.
Right. Yeah. Well, I thought it was, you know, probably if it was a character who had no tie to Opal and Nev, you know, there would not be that, of course, that person would not, you know, insert themselves into the story. And, you know, Ellen, you and I both having been working for a long time as journalists, like you avoid that kind of entanglement. But I think inserting her, giving her that personal tie and making her do that disclosure at the very beginning as to her identity and her connection to Opal and Nev was really interesting. And also a bit of my commentary on the way that media has changed, you know, since we were first involved.
Yes. Yeah, well, you were never supposed to be part of the story.
That's never supposed to be part of the story. And I think those rules have really shifted.
Certainly, especially in magazines, where I think
especially in magazines. Yeah, in newspapers, it would be like, "What are you doing?"
Well, in newspapers, it's also shifted, but I think it's a little more subtle.
Right.
But I do think that there's a kind of honesty in admitting the identity you're bringing to a story.
Yes.
And we're talking a lot about that these days, I think.
Yeah. I bet.
So are there things you learned in this whole process that are making or will make your next book easier to write?
Let me tell you, I had no idea what I was doing. I was sort of flying by the seat of my pants and really working on instinct, sort of driving toward the things that I personally thought were interesting or that made me laugh. And after a while, that became really difficult. Like I got to the end of part one, where there is sort of a major revelation that shifts the story. And that piece of it came to me as a bit of a shock. Like I didn't even really know that was going to happen. And so, I was sitting in my apartment in Iowa City, and I had these big picture windows, and I was sitting at my desk. And when I wrote that moment, I sat back in my chair and I went, oh, because it really required me to grapple with this thing that a character has done, and it changed everything. Like it's, and I didn't know where to go from there. I was stuck for probably a full semester. And I actually, I took those months off, and I was writing on short fiction because I had sort of written myself into this problem and I didn't know how to write my way out. And, so on one hand, I really loved the spontaneity of the writing, and it felt organic to me. And it felt like it led into that moment that writers talk about dreaming of, which is the moment that feels surprising but inevitable. Like everything just naturally kind of leads there. You look back and you're like, oh yeah, these are the breadcrumbs for this. But at the same time, like, I think that my next one, I think I will have a little clearer understanding of what the story is. Although I still do work from a place of characters and thinking about, who these people are and how they interact and the dynamics between them. I think I would like, in terms of the actual plot, like to do a little bit more planning so that I don't have that moment of being stuck, because the book did take a long time to write. It took about 7-8 years.
Right. And I mean, some people take that long for every book, but you might not want to.
Yeah, I want to go a little faster next time. I'm getting started a little later, so I would love to be like one of those people who's prolific. I don't know if it's possible, but we will see.
Well, I know you said before that you grew up listening to rock, indie rock, things that you didn't necessarily see yourself in. Did you listen to music while you were writing Opal and Nev? And if so, what kind?
That's when I was actually sitting and writing, no, because I need total silence to work, which greatly probably, annoys my husband because he likes noise. He likes things on in the background when he's working. But luckily we have two different offices where we live. So that's worked out fine during quarantine. But definitely in those moments when I was doing research or just doing things around the house, washing dishes or doing chores, I was listening to a lot of music from the era. I was listening to like a lot of stuff, like everything from David Bowie to, some of the artists who were inspirations for Opal. So, some Grace Jones, Nona Hendrix, stuff like that. A lot of the, post-punk stuff that I liked in high school, I was revisiting that to really think about how music makes me feel in my body. There's a scene where Sunny is writing in an editor's note about having heard Opal and Nev for the first time in her Philadelphia Public Library. In the music collection, they happen to have Opal and Nev's albums. And, writing about, she says that it's almost like it's an excitement, but almost like a fear response. And so I like went back and listened to that stuff that I liked in high school, everything from, you know, The Cure to, I don't know, like REM, all those things that were very sort of verbose and morose in some ways.
Well, that's like, I mean, the thing is that it's tricky is that they're supposed to be different from everybody else, but obviously there must be people you kind of had in mind for at least part of their.
Well, I sort of described them as kind of being like just ahead of their time. And so what I was listening to was a lot of music because so they have their heyday in like 71 to 73, like a really brief window. And so I was thinking about like those acts that were just after that. But then I was also thinking about artists today that they might have influenced. So I thought a lot about like a Janelle Monáe, you know, who is very creative and plays with personas and alter egos and works in a variety of styles and often has a political message. I was thinking about all of that. And there ended up being, you know, 3 really primary influences for Opal. One was Grace Jones in terms of her look, her style, her sort of boldness and confidence. And the difference, you know, nobody looks like her, nobody is styled like her. And you see artists today like a Lady Gaga, you know, who is wonderful, but also just like straight rips Grace Jones's style. Like I could show you side by side pictures of the 2 of them. And it's just like, girl, you're copying. So Grace Jones was one. There was an artist, Betty Davis, who I learned about during the research for this book. I had not known about her before. And she was a, you know, cult figure on the downtown scene who was making like funky rock and roll. She was married for one brief year to Miles Davis and ended up keeping, I think she said something about like, you know, that year was hard enough that she was keeping the name going forward. And she was very sort of uncompromising in her sound. She doesn't consider what she did to be singing, but more like vocalizing. And so she would do these sort of yelps and grunts and noises on the album. And she had a very provocative stage show as well. And her label didn't quite know what to do with her. And she got sick of the executives telling her all the time. And so she ended up just kind of picking up and quitting the business altogether. And I think she lives in Pittsburgh today. So she was the second. And then Nona Hendrix, who was, of course, part of LaBelle, who had Lady Marmalade, but also made some amazing rock and roll music that is very underrated. And she was also writing in a political mode often. They have a song called Who's Watching the Watcher, which I think is really incredible. And she went on to a solo career. She put out her first solo record in 1977 and has been very active and still is active today on sort of the Black rock scene. So those 3 were who I was like listening to a lot and thinking about a lot in terms of their image and their creativity and how they fared in the business.
Well, beyond the music, I mean, I have a hard time thinking of this as a historical novel because I was alive for the entire 70s.
Yeah.
But you weren't. And so you had to have done research. What was the research like beyond the music? And do you think it was different because you started out in journalism?
I think so. And I think there was one job that really affected the research, and that is I worked for Life.com, which was the rebirth of the photography magazine. And so I worked very deeply in the photo archives, and I ended up, you know, my job was to essentially, you know, curate photo galleries and write photo essays about images, basically dreaming into pictures and putting together the historical context along with the photographer's notes and all those things to tell a story of a period of time. And that was something that was hugely influential on me as a writer and just as a person. It really changed the way that I looked at photography and sort of looking for those details that really are stirring something in the viewer. And so I ended up, the research was also looking at a lot of photography. Of course I read oral histories and I watched documentaries. I watched a lot of YouTube clips from late night shows. The talk shows back then were super edgy. There's a scene where I have a transcript from the Dick Cavett show with Opal and Nev after they'd done this really wild performance. And I just loved how the stars back then were just very vocal. Like, it wasn't so much about games and skits, but it was about very provocative conversations.
Right. And they weren't just there to give you the set anecdote and then go to the clip.
That's right. Right. And then you also had this wonderful blend of celebrities along with intellectuals, and they were all sort of on this level, kind of having these conversations. And so watching a lot of that helped me to learn about the time. And it was really fun to think about. I knew at one point I wanted to send Opal to Paris for a while. And so thinking about the things that were happening in Paris at the time, and I read a book about the Battle of Versailles, which was this very, kind of landmark fashion show in which the Black models, kind of steal the show. And I wanted to put her there, all those things part of the research.
Well, there's a tragedy of, I don't want to give too much away, but there's a tragedy at the heart of this book that some have suggested has overtones of Altamont, the Rolling Stone concert, where an 18-year-old Black man, Meredith Hunter, was killed there. The circumstances in your book are obviously very different, but was any of that in your mind when you were writing?
It was. And actually, it was because I remember, again, when I was at Life, we were looking at certain years as real turning points. And I think Altamont is sort of seen as the end of a particular way that the 60s had been seen as sort of the love, hippie kind of thing, into something that was a lot more tumultuous and a lot more complicated. It was like Altamont was one of those things. The Manson murders. Kent State, exactly. Like all those things kind of happening. I think Kent State was in May of 1970.
Right. Yeah. But it sort of felt, that's when the 60s felt like it ended.
Right.
I mean, I remember, speaking of Life magazine, that's when I think of Life magazine, that is the picture I think of.
Yes. Yes. And I was actually thinking about that image when I was writing about the image that actually ends up launching Opal and Nev into the headlines, because it is a photograph. And I was thinking about that image, which was by a student photographer at the time.
Right. John Paul Philo, who went on to become, he was an Inquirer photographer for many years.
Wow.
He now works as a photographer for CBS. He's a great guy.
Wow.
But he's had a very full career, but everybody will always remember him for that photo.
Of course. And there was actually an interview recently with Mary Ann Vecchio, I believe her name is.
Oh, the girl who was not a student. I was surprised to read that.
Yeah. But it's but that's interesting you said that. You were surprised to read that, because I think that we project our own narratives a lot of times onto these photos because they seem to encapsulate something. They seem to encapsulate a moment or, something about our society, when honestly, there's lots of different stories behind them. There's real people behind them. And so I was thinking about that as well.
Well, I always thought she was a college student, and now I know she was only a few years older than I was at the time.
Yeah,
and
she was a teenage
terrifying.
Girl. I know.
So, yeah. Well, the pandemic has had a lot of people rethinking how they're living their lives, what they want to do for work. You took this big leap several years ago when you walked away from a pretty successful career. What advice do you give people with similar dreams, not necessarily to become a novelist, but want to.
Yeah, I would say it's never too late. I feel very blessed because I did have a very successful career. And so much of what we've been talking about, Ellen, in this conversation is about the different ways that that career set me up for this one. And so I realized that like nothing was wasted, like it was all necessary. It was all part of this process, you know. The oral history form is something that I learned as a journalist, learned and loved and appreciated. The looking into photographies and sort of dreaming around them was part of a job that I had. And also the fact that, you know, I was successful in the sense that I had a great, you know, nest egg. And so when it was time, I could really take that leap, you know. I would say I'm also grateful that I was older going into my MFA program because I had this clarity of vision. I knew what I wanted to do. I had my, you know, I had my lifelong friends of 20 plus years. You know, I had a supportive family. I wasn't yet married at the time, but I was in a solid and loving relationship. We've since gotten married in the pandemic. But I had built all those things. And so like that first step off the ledge was the hardest one. And then after that, everything was thrilling. And it's been a beautiful surprise. So I would say like when you're ready to take that leap, that risk, like it's important to have that kind of clarity of vision, to know, to also maybe give yourself rules. I gave myself 2 rules that were really crucial. The first was when I applied to McDowell, I promised myself that if I got in, I was really going for it, meaning that I was going to quit my job and not worry about it for the moment and just focus on that one thing. That was the first thing. And then the second one was when I went into my MFA program, I said that I was going to come out with the full draft that was ready for agents to read by graduation. And I stuck to those 2 things and they worked out.
That's good. Well, I know you, one of the fun things about this book is the fictional interviews. I mean, you have Henry Rollins calling Opal a pioneer of punk. You got quotes from Janelle Monáe, Philly's own Questlove, Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, Quentin Tarantino, and Dick Cavett. How did you choose them? And have you ever met any of these people?
Have I met any of them? I met Janelle Monáe very briefly when I worked at Essence and she was on the cover. I have not met Questlove, but I have been to events where he's DJ'd. So I've been in the same room with him. But basically I was choosing people that I thought would have, you know, an interesting take or interesting things to say about Opal and Nev. They felt, you know, Opal and Nev for me felt very real for me when I was writing them. And so that was also a moment of me putting on my journalist hat and thinking like, who would have something interesting to say about these people and these events?
So like, who should I call?
Yeah, who should I call? Right, exactly. Who would I call if I were a journalist? Who would be the dream list, you know? And so that's typically, you know, how I was selecting them. And with, you know, I just greatly admired Dick Cavett's show. Like I just loved like the mix of personalities that he had on there. And I thought, you know, I was often also just doing lots of research into the years that I had things set. And so it happened to be that Jane Fonda had just won the Academy Award for Clute at the time when Opal and Nev would have been on Dick Cavett. And so, you know, I was thinking, oh, she would be a great person to kind of back Opal up in this argument. She's making this thing that she's saying. And it's been interesting to watch, watching Jane Fonda accept her, I think it was a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Globes.
I think so,
and to know that she has been so like amazing and political her entire life, it was kind of cool to see that and be like, yeah, she would have been cool back then too.
Oh, she would, yeah.
Yeah.
She's a good interview too. She's but this way you didn't have to go through publicists or anything. You could just write what you thought they should say.
It was fun. And it was a bit of satire as well, in moments.
Well, your book editor, Dawn Davis, is now editor of Bon Appetit, for which you wrote a story this month. Have you two had conversations about her moving from publishing to magazines?
We haven't, we check in with each other every now and then just because we're friendly and because she has been such a wonderful support for this novel. And it was really interesting, when she told me that she was going to make the move. It was like we were trading places in a way. I was never editor-in-chief, but I was pretty high up on the masthead, and I sort of knew the challenges, honestly, that, are facing magazines. And, meanwhile, I'm coming into an area of publishing that I am learning about every day. And so, I think that we both have been on this learning curve and supporting each other through that. But it's been so exciting to see the things that she's doing at Bon Appetit. And I'm so happy for her.
Well, is there a particular book or books that you read growing up that made you want to write books?
Ooh, yeah, there have been a few, but the one that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and the one that I still read every year as an adult, is my favorite book from childhood. And that would be Ramona and Her Father by Beverly Cleary, who we actually, of course, lost recently. The way that she gets at the interior life of a child, I wasn't recognizing it as that when I was reading it at age 8 or whatever for the first time. And I love the way that she portrays Ramona as someone who thinks a lot about how she's perceived and also worries a lot. I'm also a bit of a worrywart. It runs in my family on my mother's side, people who kind of are in their heads and worry a lot. And
I think we call those people writers.
Yeah. Maybe I'm in the perfect career after all. Yeah. But in that book, Ramona just is worrying about so much. She's worried about her dad, who's lost his job and he starts smoking, and she's trying to figure out how she can help the family and all those things. I loved her so much, and I empathized with her so much. And there was something special about seeing that kind of reflection on the page. And so that's one that I like to talk about. I'm not sure, I always was sort of writing little stories from childhood, little things about family vacations. And my grandfather always used to say, you're going to write my life story one day, you're going to so it was always kind of just a given. I don't know that there was a light bulb moment where it was like, I want to be a writer. But in terms of books that I just adored and really felt like they unlocked something emotionally, that was probably the very first one.
Well, it was one of the nicer things. I mean, she lived to be 104, but one of the nicest things about all the obituaries for Beverly Cleary is how many of us discovered that everybody else felt the same way about Ramona.
I know. Yeah.
She brought up a lot of people. So
she did. Between her and Judy Blume. And, when I was older, it was Zora Neale Hurston who had a huge impact on reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was the first book by a Black woman writer that I was assigned to read in school. And I was from North Florida as well. And so all of that was really beautiful and reflective of me as an only child and a dreamer like Janie is in that book. And the way that Hurston is doing some really kind of experimental things in that book, I feel, in terms of,
Yeah.
the formal narration of the prose versus the vernacular of the dialogue, those things being in conversation and living on the page at the same time, like that kind of thing, when I got older and could process what writers were actually doing, was hugely influential.
Yeah, and it was so beautifully, I don't know, I think they worked so well together. I love that book.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a line in the beginning of this book where Sunny's talking about her promotion to editor-in-chief of her magazine, and she writes that despite working hard, I still worried that the reasons for my success would be questioned by even the most progressive white colleagues. Are those feelings you had dealt with in your own career?
Yeah. I will say, I think that I will say that there is a healthy dose of me and sort of some of my worries and anxieties working in media in the Sunny character. And, at Time Inc. is now, I'm sorry, Essence is now, Black owned, independently owned. But, when I worked there, Time Inc. was our parent company. And I would say, that was probably like the staff of Essence, incredible miracle workers in the sense that, we were putting out a magazine and of course all the digital properties and the annual Essence Festival, which brought 500,000 people to New Orleans every year. And yet there were times where it was very frustrating to have this ownership that controlled the budgets and was also like very much often questioning things editorially and everything from the cover to, the programming. And it was just like, do you trust me? There's a moment in the book where Sunny also asks her white boss, like, do you trust me as this person you hired? Like, what am I here for if I'm not making these judgments, these decisions? And I think, that was something that we sometimes dealt with. I feel like I can talk about it a little bit now, since sadly no longer, Time Inc. no longer exists. But there was always like a friction there.
Well, it's probably not gone away just because that particular company did the.
True.
So we have some questions from people watching. One of them is, I love the cover design of your book. Did you get to direct that?
So thank you so much. I love the cover as well. And what I ended up doing was I sent some covers that I loved in terms of, it could be the colors. I knew I wanted something very kind of bright and arresting, to a bit of a vintage feel, a mood. And so I sent those off and they came back with maybe about, 7 kind of variations, 7 different directions. The typography was always kind of the same, but, there were some where we had like a vintage cityscape of New York. There were others that were just sort of the type treatment, but in a very like 70s style. And this jacket was designed by Dave Littman. And it was probably, this is a riff on probably the very first design that he sent. So there was always the colors and the guitar, but we played around with what was going on in the guitar. And
I'm actually surprised you had that much input that you would.
Yeah, a lot of it was like a beautifully collaborative experience, It was great.
Because I don't always hear those stories.
Yeah, and I was told, it would be, people had very different stories about how that part of the process went. But luckily I had a lot of input on that.
Well, someone is asking, how did you pitch this book to agents, both story-wise and comparable books? Do you say?
Yeah, the comparable books there weren't really any at the time because, Daisy Jones wasn't yet out. Daisy Jones and the Six is a novel by Taylor Jenkins Reid that came out in 2019, by which time I had already sold this book and was just doing the slow, agonizing wait for it to come out. And like I think, I had met a few different agents that I liked, who they came through Iowa to meet with some of the students. And also I went to a summer workshop called Tin House, which was also a great place to meet agents. And basically I shared with people only the first like 10 pages so they could get a feel for the story and the feel for the format. And I didn't share any more of it until it was done. And I wasn't really looking for an agent until it was done. But, I was very kind of strategic in the agents that I was pitching to. Like I didn't send it out to a bunch of people. I sent it to maybe 5 that I thought would be up for selling something that at the time felt hugely experimental. Something that was sort of, straddling a line between like, it was fiction, but in a nonfiction way. And I ended up going with an agent who really believed in the experimental nature of it and believed in the format, even though, he warned me that some people aren't going to connect with this, but that's okay. We're going to find you the person who does.
Well, in looking for an agent, I mean, you say you narrowed it to people. Is that something that like Iowa was better for helping you figure out?
Yeah,
like
and I will say that my classmate, well, he was a year ahead of me at Iowa, Deshaun Charles Winslow, who wrote a beautiful book called In West Mills. Everyone should read that one. But he was the one who connected me with my agent. He told his agent about me and then told me, when you're done, you should send this to this agent. And so in addition to giving you the time and the space, an MFA program is also great for like making those connections and building your writer community, because honestly, a lot of the programs are very much, as they mostly should be, they're focused on the actual craft of writing and not so much the professional aspects. For some reason, publishing remains something that's opaque and something that we learn about through word of mouth and talking to each other. And so the larger you can make your network of writers, like the better for you, because you'll learn how everything works and you'll learn, who might be a good fit for you in terms of an agent or a publishing imprint or any of those things.
And publishing has shrunk like everything else too. So
and it's shrinking further. Yeah.
I mean, you talk to writers now and who have had bestsellers in the past, and they're under much tighter restrictions about what they can do and what's considered marketable.
Exactly. And the fact that, a writer, I really would hope that, and I hope it doesn't get to a point where writers are worried very much about what is marketable, because my philosophy is like, you should write what pleases you and know that there is an audience for it somewhere. At least that's what I was telling myself. And I would hope that remains the case, because you want to stay true to your vision and your voice.
We have a comment from a Kathy Strauss who says that the audiobook was fantastic. Did you choose or vet the actors who read your book?
Thank you so much. I was so excited about the audiobook, and I think it's fantastic too. So for the longest time, I was so curious about how they were going to approach the audio, because it is quite complex. It has a lot of different voices. It has footnotes. It has transcripts, all of these things. And once I learned that a full cast was being done, I was hugely excited. And what ended up happening was the Simon Audio folks sent me some their suggestions for the principal cast. So that was Opal, Sunny, Pearl, Virgil, Nev, and Howie, I think, and Bob Hayes. And I was able to listen to different audio stuff they've done to kind of see if the tone of the voice and the style of the voice fit with what I was hearing.
The voices in your head.
Exactly. And they were pretty spot on. And so the production came together very quickly. I was sort of amazed by how it came together. And before it was released, I got to listen to the full thing and, gave a couple of like notes here and there. And but while they were producing it, they would also send me questions about pronunciations and questions about like how, is this character like, does it sound like this actor, and kind of going back and forth on that to give notes to the actors.
It's interesting because I one of the things that drives me crazy in some audiobooks is a male reader or a female reader trying to do the opposite sex thing, particularly men doing women's voices.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And this almost sounds more like a radio play.
Oh, absolutely. People are having great fun listening to it. And, I didn't know this, but you could actually order a CD recording of it. And my husband actually ordered it, and it came and it was like 10 discs in this thick.
I remember having audiobooks on CD before Audible put it on my phone.
It's super cool. Yeah, so I have all audio versions of this book.
I think we own some of the original Harry Potters that way.
Oh, wow.
And including we would go to London and buy the one that, I don't know. There's a different reader for London. Peter Fry? I think Peter Fry, did the narration for the original Harry Potters, but only in the English versions. And we would go get those. Cool. But yeah, it's hard to believe it. Now it's all on my phone.
I know. Yeah.
So Renee is asking, this book is begging for a film and soundtrack album. Have you been fielding any of those offers?
Thank you so much for saying that, and I have heard quite often that people feel like this is a very cinematic story. And I take that as a huge compliment because, as a former entertainment journalist, like I'm very much into film, very much into television. It would be a dream. And that's all I can really say about it. But I would love for it to happen. I'm very much in favor of it happening. And I would love to hear anybody's casting ideas. That's been like a really fun thing to kind of think about. And I actually had someone on Instagram actually did like a casting board, like a mood board kind of thing, where it was like for the different parts. And I was like, how cool is that?
So before we go, what are you reading now? First of all, are you writing? I know you don't want to talk yet about your next book, but are you writing right now?
I am actually, but that is a very recent development. And when I say writing, it means I'm just sort of playing with some things right now, without any expectation that it's going to be, included in whatever next project that I'm working on. But I'm finally in the place where like, I'm getting some quiet again. And so I'm trying to like lean into that quiet and get back into a writing voice again. So yes.
Well, has the pandemic interfered, or was it the fact that you have to promote a new book and that's a whole job in itself?
Yeah, it's both those things hitting like a hurricane. The promotions is hugely exciting and I have loved it. It is time consuming. So it leaves less time for that quiet. And then the pandemic, just the anxieties around it And but I got my second dose last week, so I'm excited about that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to thinking about these characters that I'm playing with. There's 4 of them, and I'm kind of leaning into one very deeply right now and hoping to sort of see how the others come in.
Yeah, it sounds like an ideal thing. You can't leave the house for more than a year without being fully masked. Oh, of course you'll get a lot of work done, but it's sort of like when people go on maternity leave the first time and they think they're going to write a book.
Right.
It turns out to be much more complicated.
Much more complicated. And besides that, like, a lot of the inspiration is out in the world, you know, just like observing people and ear hustling, as we call it, eavesdropping, you know, and I live in New York, you know, so I miss that energy, that kind of daily inspiration that you get just looking at people and being around people. So I'm looking forward to that opening up safely and slowly.
Are you finding any time to read other people? Is there anything you want to recommend?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple books that are coming out soon. One is Revival Season by Monica West, which is a beautiful kind of coming of age story about she's a 15-year-old Black girl whose father is a faith healer, faith preacher. That book is really tender and really beautiful. There's a book called The Other Black Girl that's coming out June 1st by Zakiya Dalila Harris, and it is about sort of the publishing industry. It's a bit of a Ramona Clef. And it was fun and funny to read. And then I'm also going back to, you know, some classics that I never have read. And one of them, the one that I'm reading now, is The Women of Brewster Place by Gloria Naylor, which is a beautiful.
I remember a miniseries.
It was a miniseries starring Oprah. Oprah was in it.
Right. I'm not sure. I must have read. I probably did read the book because I used to read the books before I read about them or even watch them, but it's been a long time.
It's really beautiful. I love it. And I love anything that has multiple characters and intersections, you know. It's sort of you know, I mean, people talk about Olive Kittredge, which does that, but this book was before. Yeah.
Well, there's yeah, that's true. It's a different, I think it's sort of like TV also has gotten more complicated. You don't need just one storyline. And I think people have come to accept books as being able to handle more than one thing. Just as you have 2 timelines in this, and it works fine.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm afraid that's pretty much all the time we have. Just a reminder that you can buy Opal and Nev at Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books in Germantown, or order online by clicking the link on this page. Thank you so much to Dawnie Walton for this great discussion, to all of you today for joining us on Inquirer Live.
Thank you, Ellen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.